From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. Canada's vaccine drive is now a race against time, as some doctors warn that a third wave of COVID is coming. Canada's COVID-19 vaccination campaign started on the same day as the US back in December, but we are now lagging far behind not just the neighbours, but also at least 30 other countries. It's all set to pick up soon, and deliveries are ramping up in Canada with millions of doses of the Pfizer, Moderna, and now AstraZeneca vaccines coming in this week. But with currently a little more than 1% of the population fully vaccinated, will we be able to meet the September deadline of getting shots into 38 million Canadians? And should it actually be done sooner to get ahead of this virus? Dr. David Naylor, co-chair of the Federal COVID-19 Immunity Task Force, is on today's episode of This Matters to talk about Canada's vaccine rollout and if there's something to be learned from other countries and how they're calling the shots. Hi, David. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here, Saba.
So, what does the vaccine rollout look like for Canada? And I know while it's not very feasible to compare Canada's vaccine rollout to other provinces even, let alone other countries, but I'm still going to ask, what's your assessment of how it's going so far?
I would say that we started out pretty slowly. We had a number of struggles and we're picking up momentum, thank heavens. But we're still, though we're moving up the league tables, some distance behind, no other way to describe it. Bit of interprovincial variation, but sort of 11 doses per 100 population would be the number we're looking at. Many other countries are a fair bit further along, and we have work to do.
And the critique is, as you also have mentioned, that Canada's lagging a little behind a lot of countries, despite being looked at as a success story last year in dealing with the pandemic. And for example, we have the US to compare to, where Canada was seen to be doing much better in terms of casualties and infection rates. So how did the US far outpace us on vaccine rollouts? What's been different in Washington's strategy?
So I think part of this is simply that they procured a very large amount of vaccine early on. Canada's strategy was to set us up for what I would say would be medium or intermediate term success, with a lot of the vaccines arriving in the second quarter and third quarter, and other countries have front loaded. What that means is they got a faster start, and now as their supplies continue and in some cases grow, to maintain a lead. So that first quarter is where we lost some ground. We focused it, you'll remember, on high priority groups, the seniors in congregate facilities like long-term care homes and residential homes. We focused it on frontline healthcare workers, but that supply was pretty thin. And now we're into a phase where the supplies are expanding as we come to the end of this first quarter. And now we have a chance to catch up if we can get our act together. And that's an if that worries me a bit, because Canada's had a bit of an epidemic of ineffectiveness in delivering things the last year.
So there's some catching up to do. And while in many ways this might be an unprecedented situation, but it's not unfamiliar. You led a group of experts who worked on a definitive report about the SARS outbreak. So can you speak to some of the findings when it comes to vaccines? And does it look like there were any lessons Canada should have utilized by now in terms of an immunization strategy that we don't see?
In fairness, the SARS outbreak abated so quickly. While there was work on vaccines and some very good Canadian work underway, most of that went into abeyance, and the focus was on standing up the Public Health Agency of Canada and building some better collaborative machinery between the federal government and the provinces and territories to keep Canadians' health protected and to do health promotion. So that was very much the focus of the machinery. That said, there's no question that we saw at the time there was a problem with the lack of a national immunization strategy. Some of that work has, in fact, been done through the years, but it really looks to me as though, as happened, for example, with the Global Public Health Information Network, some momentum simply was lost along the way. In that case, seems to have been a shutdown. In the case of immunization, more generally a sort of focus on production and building domestic capacity, we really have not kept pace with where we should have been. We proposed a standing investment in a national immunization strategy. There was an initial very strong investment, in fairness, made by the federal government to try to get more vaccines in the hands of the provinces and figure out how to protect particularly younger Canadians better. We moved to a world, Saba, where there's a lot more vaccines for adults that are relevant. And I think we're going to have to rebuild that strategy after this this epidemic recedes in a pretty serious way. We also, and we did encourage this, we also need to think about production. We've struggled with domestic production. There's been all kinds of coverage of it and explanations and rationales. We did encourage there to be some public-private partnerships to actually create domestic production capacity. Others have argued, and I think it's reasonable, that maybe we want more of a public nonprofit strategy. Whatever the strategy, we've not managed to get vaccine production ramped up. Some small companies have said they weren't given a shot. Some of the bigger companies have their own priorities and elected not to come to the table to create COVID vaccines for us. I think at the end of the day, we have to do a very serious stock taking about vaccine production, how much we want to be in the game, how we want to be in the game, and sort out a way forward that is an appropriate mix of public and private activity so we are never caught flat-footed again.
Right. These are some important lessons to be gleaned here. I also want to talk about your current work, David. You're doing so much work advising the government on this as co-chair of the Immunity Task Force. Can you share some more of your recommendations or what you've been talking about in terms of how we can have a better vaccination rollout, a speedier one?
We've been thinking about a whole bunch of different issues at the task force. One of the things we've done is to recognize that a lot of the vaccine-specific expertise is in other groups. So the Public Health Agency of Canada set up a vaccine surveillance reference group led by the head of the Canadian Immunization Research Network, Scott Halpern from Dalhousie, and also co-led by Carolyn Quash from the University of Montreal, who's the chair of the National Advisory Committee on Immunization. We also have Karina Topp and Jeff Kwong, two individuals who have expertise in vaccine safety or surveillance for adverse effects, as well as vaccine effectiveness from provincial public health authorities. So the result is that leadership group, working with our task force and others who we've added specifically, including Shelley Deeks, who's vice chair of NACI and the chief health protection officer in Nova Scotia, are trying to sort through now a very interesting agenda of research, trying to make sure that these vaccines are deployed safely and to try to compare effectiveness. We've already had a rolling call for research proposals. We've already worked with multiple provincial authorities to set up surveillance networks for safety. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're getting into a very good position to make sure that we have a well-informed, cutting-edge line of sight on just how safe and effective all these vaccines are. It's been hectic, but we've shifted to focus very much on vaccines right now, and I think we're getting to where we need to be. Lots of debates, however, as you know, Saba, about what the strategy should be. Again, we're trying to get information on that.
We'll be right back. If we sort of analyze Canada and the vaccine strategy on a sort of global scale, are there any lessons for us in how other countries have approached their vaccination rollouts? Let's start with one of the top contenders. For example, Israel leads the world currently in vaccines administered per population. What would you attribute their massive success to? And are there any similar strategies we can utilize?
So I think you've got a bit of a sui generis issue with Israel because they acquired an absolutely massive stock of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, and a small country, a lot easier to manage in that geography, and strong national health system. So it really isn't very generalizable to a country like Canada or even the US with a lot of rural population that has to be reached, although the numbers are smaller, of course. These are both strongly urban societies. We are widely spread out on both sides of the border, so very different geography. And so I think some of the analogs that I'd look to are more in our European allies and the UK and the US. If we look at Europe, well, those countries are struggling in terms of both supply at times. There have been hiccups as well as getting their coverage rolling. And we see tough third waves starting to build in Germany, France, and Italy. And the two major countries that are near the top of the tables are a contrast. They're a complete study in contrast. The US has had an extraordinary supply of vaccines. That's been their ticket. That's, the main reason, I think, more than anything, that they've zoomed ahead is their tremendous supply. And then they've just had a massive variation in modes of delivering it. At times when they've tried to go too fast, as has been reported recently, they've gotten into trouble with crashing websites and mass vax centers that have been overrun. So very pluralistic, as you would expect in such a big country with diversity. Nonetheless, we're looking at coverage rates in the US where, most states, around 25% of people have had at least one shot. So this is a pretty good number. And when you think about completing the series, You've got another 14% who have completed their series, and that number is being boosted. It's a little bit of a cheat, a little bit of an advantage, because they got a lot of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, Saba, and that only requires one shot. So they're zooming ahead using double doses of the mRNA vaccines and using the Janssen or J&J vaccine to shorten things up a bit. They're also sticking pretty close to that 3-4 week schedule set in the trials. So that's slowing them down a bit in terms of coverage. Some authorities in the US are urging that they space it out a bit to go faster because they do have a risk of a third wave. But so far, that's been an effective strategy. And I think all of us are watching with some anxiety because mask mandates are being lifted. There is a bit of an individualistic ethos in a lot of those states. So you see that the third wave did come down sharply, but there's a little tick back up that worries me. Maybe you could call that a fourth wave or a blip on the third wave. That's a worry. The UK is completely different. The UK, it's 43% of the population, I think at last count, has had a jab, but only 3.6% have had two jabs. And all the vaccines being used are two-shot vaccines. So what they did was they said, okay, we're going to do first doses fast. We're going to give a first shot to as many people as possible, and we'll space the two shots out, not by the 3 to 4 weeks for the mRNA vaccines that the trials did, but we'll give them, in this case, the Pfizer vaccine. The two shots will be up to 12 weeks apart. And again, that made a lot of us nervous as we watched it. We thought, boy, this is tough sledding. And then with the AstraZeneca vaccine, they had a stronger footing for making that decision because the AstraZeneca vaccine is a more traditional vaccine, viral vaccine, instead of an mRNA vaccine. And that one, as it turned out in the clinical trials, they were able to prove pretty clearly that it was good for 12 weeks with a single dose, steady effectiveness, and also happily that it boosted better after 12 weeks than 4 weeks, which is often the case with vaccines. They sort of mature like Scotch whiskey or old wine, and they boost better and longer and stronger if you give them some time. Primer for the booster. So they've done that. They're still moving along that 12-week window and getting to the end of it for many people. We'll see how the boosters go, but the goal here is to remember, cover a lot of people fast, and you can really, with a lower number of vaccines, get more done. And they have broken their third wave for all intents and purposes.
Right. So that's a take on the first dose strategy. And as you mentioned, the latest research on AstraZeneca now, and with the approval of AstraZeneca here, do you think Canada should be looking at it as a way to get more shots to more people? The first dose strategy, let's say.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting challenge, and a great question. AstraZeneca has kind of been accident prone, I'm afraid. They've had manufacturing glitches, trial glitches, reporting glitches, the latest, of course, in the last couple of days, where they've gotten into trouble with their data safety and monitoring board on their US trial. So you add in this very rare blood clotting issue that's arisen, and I think there's some hesitancy about AstraZeneca. Personally, I don't share it. My spouse has had her first dose of AstraZeneca. I would be very happy to get it. The reason being that, as I said, it gives you 3 months of very solid protection, and it makes it easier to space things out. And it does protect competitively with the mRNA vaccines against serious disease and death. The advantage of the mRNA vaccines is they do more to prevent mild and moderate disease. They are somewhat more efficient at the less severe end of the spectrum. But for many of us, the key is that nice balance of long-term protection that's steady and avoiding severe disease. So I think they're all amazing vaccines. I'd take any of them in a flash. They're just fantastic. The J&J is tempting because you only have to get the one shot, of course. But I think the AstraZeneca vaccine could be very helpful to us here in Canada. And I hope, despite all the hitches and glitches and concerns, that we actually adopt it and use it widely.
And this first dose strategy, could this be used for senior and vulnerable people as well? Or do you suggest something different in that case?
That's a great question as well. The UK did not really fine-grain their 12-week rollout, and Quebec, as you know, has moved ahead with 13-week or 90-day separation and has done very well with it in terms of getting protection, even with these mRNA vaccines. So it looks as though you certainly can stretch the dosing intervals pretty safely, even in the more vulnerable populations like seniors in long-term care. I think there is some reason to be cautious, however. We are seeing a lot of antibody studies, particularly for the messenger RNA vaccines, that suggest the immune response is weaker in older people. We see that with people who've had transplants and people who are undergoing cancer treatment. So that evidence is not, of course, as strong in making decisions as this great real-world clinical evidence saying people simply aren't getting serious COVID-19 even waiting several weeks after getting one of these mRNA vaccines. But it's a data point you have to think about. My instinct here would be that, this recommendation of waiting up to 16 weeks probably is reasonable for low-risk people. I'd certainly want to watch that last month because we don't really have a lot of information. Only the UK is going out to 12 weeks in Quebec. So we're going to have to be careful about that last month in everyone. But I think for people at higher risk, we probably need to think a bit more like doctors and less in the public health mode and say, we better protect some of those people with an earlier second dose. I don't think it needs to be 3 or 4 weeks like the trials. I think we know it's safe to wait a little longer. Lets us cover more people faster, which is good for overall protection. Remember, vaccines protect two ways, directly and indirectly, both being infected and transmitting. So you do want to cover a lot of people fast, but I would personally be inclined, if I were advising government, and indeed I have advised government in this direction, that we should be a little more cautious about stretching those intervals for the elderly, for those who are immunocompromised, and others who are at risk who may have weaker immune responses. We should keep studying it. We may be able to stretch further, but I think in the short run, we better keep a close eye on this and be very careful.
Right, because there's a lot of people that are saying we just don't know enough at this point whether a one-shot strategy can provide intermediate or long-term immunity, or whether the stretch of time kind of ends up with more super infectious variants being developed, right?
So let me just deal with that because there are some issues there that I think are getting blended together. First, UK experience is clear-cut. You will have a better shot at breaking the back of a third wave if you do what the UK has done in a situation where you're not awash in vaccine. And no one really is, I think, except the US and for a while Israel. I think they've used up a lot of theirs already. So I do think first dose is fast is the way to go. First dose is fast doesn't mean no second doses, though. It's not a first dose only strategy. Everyone believes that unless you've had the J&J vaccine, you better get your second jab. And even the J&J, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up finding out that it works better with a booster, albeit a later one. So that's very important to remember, that no one's saying don't boost these things with a second jab. The issue of mutants is also, if I can say so, a bit speculative. As I recall, the 3 vaccine variants, or viral variants we worry about right now, all arose in areas where we had little or no vaccine coverage. So these things will spring up on their own simply in areas of high transmission. Hectic viral replication is probably as much an issue as anything else. So controlling the epidemic and cutting the replication rate is probably as helpful as worrying about this speculative risk of creating mutations based on people who are incompletely immunized. Remember that even if you have a very good strategy, there will be people who really don't respond fully, just the way things play. So I think that risk is being overstated when we know that we have a B117 variant-driven epidemic building in Ontario. And the B117, that Kent variant, is taking over. We see other provinces where it's gaining momentum. We know these vaccines work against it. We know it was predominant in the UK. They did a first dose is fast strategy. They broke that epidemic. So I do think we have to not overstate the risks. On the other hand, as I said, there are people for whom I would worry that either would get a low and slow response, or maybe if we went out too far, the booster might not take. And those are the people I worry about, the ones who are vulnerable, the super seniors. I think we just have to put a little bit of a nuance in this strategy and be very smart about finding some good compromises to make sure that everyone does well.
David, how confident are we that Canada's rollout will meet its predicted targets at this rate? Canada has procured more doses per capita than any country in the world, and Prime Minister Trudeau said everyone who wants to be inoculated will be by the end of September. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, I can see it happening, but boy, Saba, it would be nice to do it faster. As I said, this sort of sense that nothing is quite moving as quickly and as well as one might like is really, I think, demoralizing for Canadians. To give you an example locally, we're finally piloting having family doctors be involved in the rollout in Ontario. But, what did seem to happen, and I don't mean to be critical here, was, we had trouble getting this going except out of the hospitals. And then there sort of, without a huge amount of notice, it moved to the local health units. And somehow in all of that, family doctors who've been so integral to delivering vaccines to so many people really didn't get a lot of time and attention as to how they might play a role. And I think we have to make sure that, at least in this province, we think about every possible mechanism, including family physicians, to get jabs into arms. Nationally, I think there's a lot of pluralism in how it's being done. Quebec's a little bit ahead with more of a first dose fast strategy there, but I think we have catching up to do. So By the end of September, sure, I can see that. Would it be a lot nicer and smarter to have a great Canada Day where we got enough people covered with at least one dose and two into some of the people at risk so that we didn't leave them waiting too long? We could do that. We put our minds to it, cover the people who are at risk with the second dose and get first doses into a whole bunch of people and start to slow this train down. And that's where I think we should be aiming.
The earlier, the better, obviously, in this scenario. Thank you so much for your time and your insight, David.
A great pleasure. And let us hope we see a lot more light at the end of this epidemic tunnel in the weeks and months ahead.
Here's hoping. I was speaking to Dr. David Naylor, co-chair of the Federal COVID-19 Immunity Task Force. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Saba Eitizaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.